Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and when the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry was first announced, I was the one that pointed out that, well, there's no powers here pertaining to police involvement and ability to investigate how the police have or have not investigated. So as a result of that, the perceived weakness that this really didn't have much power to achieve much, as well as the plague of so many people quitting, including one lawyer who I went to school with, who is highly regarded in her field of human rights. I never got around to, quite frankly, reviewing the report in detail because I really had no confidence in its process, in what it was set out to do in the first place, and how things progressed. And it came to my attention when I was reviewing the Notice of Constitutional Question that I covered off in detail in the episode called Section 35 Cannabis, that here we have another example with the MMIW report being used by Canada in order to create this illusion of Indigenous nations not existing and their only abilities as Aboriginal or Indigenous groups being confined to their internal jurisdiction, if you will. This is very much the Harvard model of sovereignty. This is where, when I was beginning to first speak of Indigenous sovereignty and describing the continuing existence of Indigenous nations, very soon after Harvard came to co-opt the concept and redefine. This is a common strategy of redefining terms, attaching new kinds of meanings, so that when people use the term, they can be seen, or it's hoped that they can be seen to later in years when they're not here to say exactly what they intended and what they meant by using the term, that they'll actually, have other words put in their mouth. And so this Harvard model of sovereignty, again, is like the American dependent domestic nation, underneath, beneath, conquered. That situation does not exist in what we call Canada. There were no wars, there was no conquering, there were treaties, and those treaties acknowledged the Indigenous nations and their land ownership. So what do we find? Another attempt, as I said, to provide evidence in this report. And this part was quoted in the Notice of Constitutional Question, and I'll just read it again. It says that Indigenous peoples have the right to govern themselves in relation to matters that are internal to their communities, integral to their unique cultures, identities, traditions, languages, and institutions. And that was quoted here from Volume 1B, page 171 of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, the National Inquiry. Why? If what I'm saying were not true, there would be no need to keep paper trailing and making statements, appointing certain Indigenous people to head these kinds of things and have them put this sort of statement into the report. What has that got to do with the fact of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and men, for that matter? I still am not going to spend the time reading that report, because this just confirms to me that it's all just another one of the tactics of manipulating and manufacturing consent to say, oh, we really don't have sovereignty. If we do have this sovereignty, it really is our own internal sovereignty, and that's municipal in nature. Plus throw in our dances and culture and maybe language. That the sovereignty of Indigenous nations goes far further than that. And every attempt to say otherwise really should emphasize to people that it's true, that this exists, And this is what Canada is having to come to terms with. It shouldn't have to. It's just they're trying to change what is on the ground. They're trying to encourage and manipulate and buy, quite frankly, a capitulation. But it's not happening, as we can see by the elements and the speaking out that's happening across Canada. It's important to know that these people in media who are saying, oh, and they bring out the same old stuff like we see in this report that says, you know, it's only what's internal. It's not going to keep working. Yeah, you can tamp down the pressures for a time, but you know what? Each time it comes back, and it comes back even stronger. And quite frankly, you have a population now of a generation that did not go to residential school. They have, yes, some of them have been raised in dysfunctional families, but they're breaking through that cycle. They're not repeating the trauma and the abuse. Some of them are being, even though they've been taken away at a young age, are being called to action and are able to defend their people, unlike those who maybe lived on reserve their whole lives. It's a dynamic, it's a power that's not going to be suffocated by, you know, these kinds of statements found in reports that obviously 100 years from now will be relied upon. But you know what? Indigenous nationals today are making their own record of what they said and what they did in this time. And it's important that Canada and Canadians start to take note of that and realize it's a whole lot easier to deal with it on the basis upon which Canada was founded, and stop trying to change history and change the facts on the ground. And that's all I have to say.